His absolutely perfect car has been reduced, and he sent us photographs of this. It's striking. No wonder he said he almost cried. It's just the shell of a car. There's just a bit of the body. The bonnet, the doors are all gone. The sunroof's been ripped out. The boot's gone. The motor's gone. The transmission's gone. The wheels are gone. It's only the shell of the car that's left. I'm Andrew Rule. This is Life and Crimes. Today, car theft. It's the crime that's been going on for a good 100 years, ever since the pioneers of car theft jumped into great-granddad's T-model Ford and just drove it away at a very low speed. Because back in those days, in the 1920s, when the Tin Lizzie, as they were called, was mass-produced by Henry Ford, they were everywhere around the English-speaking world, and they were very easy to take because I don't think there was any security attached to them, really. And as time went on, of course, cars became notionally more secure. They ended up with ignition keys and all the rest of it. And, of course, the thieves just kept up with the technology. And by the time I was a young person learning to drive, every scallywag around the place, every bad boy in every form at school knew how to hotwire a car. They could pull the wires out from behind the ignition keys, twist two together and start the car. Others used screwdrivers, etc. Pretty simple if you knew how. Then car makers got more ingenious, and they used immobilisers and all this sort of stuff, and people started to make steering locks. We all at some stage have owned a big ugly thing called a club lock, which I think had the advantage of deterring the casual thief. The casual thief would walk along and see a steering lock on a car and go to the next car. It did have that advantage. But, of course, the reality was that if they were on good cars that professional thieves wanted, and when I say good cars that were saleable or highly usable for committing crimes, it wouldn't deter them much because they could cut off a steering lock fairly rapidly, with probably initially with bolt cutters or by hacksawing a little chunk out of the steering wheel, which would disable the steering lock and make it useless, and they'd still be able to steer the car. So, with every level of inventiveness used to deter thieves, the thieves would inevitably come up with some other inventions to steal cars, and that's the way it's gone. Now, this appeared for a while to be a bit of a thing of the past when car makers started to build into cars at the factory pretty high-end anti-theft devices, and these were electronic in nature, and it meant that your car was basically disabled electronically. And there were also a range of aftermarket immobilisers available. I remember having a very bad car. I wish somebody had stolen this car. It never got stolen. I wish it had. And it had an immobiliser, an aftermarket immobiliser, where if you put your hand down, right down in the footwell and found a little switch, you could turn it off or on or something, and allegedly it wouldn't start. Eventually, after a few months, I just left it because I wished somebody had taken that car and burnt it. And in the end, I traded it in on a new car to get rid of it, to be honest. So where are we headed with this? We're saying that the manufacturers got rolling and started to build stuff into cars so that thieves would find it hard. Now, for a while there, and I'm probably guessing early this century, let's say, from the 90s through to the first decade of this century, there was a time, I think, when car theft tapered off a bit because of all this good factory-made stuff. But everything goes in waves. And what has happened is that the rise of cheap computer technology has meant that every would-be car thief can now afford, from eBay or Amazon or Temu or somewhere, to buy gadgets that are very sophisticated in concept but very cheaply produced, and those gadgets, electronic devices, which thieves can use to get into cars. Of course, all this sort of gear is initially invented so that mechanics and engineers and some owners, drivers, can service cars and check the electronics and tune them and all that sort of stuff. But the problem is that those same devices or their very near cousins can be used by thieves to break into cars, to disable the immobilisers and to bypass the immobilisers and to drive them away. And so we now have a situation where people can walk around town, thieves can walk around town or take the train around town or drive another stolen car around town, and they can approach your car or any other car with a $30 gizmo in their pocket or a $50 gizmo in their pocket, and that gizmo will allow them, if they break into a car, which they do often by breaking the quarter window behind the driver, if they break into the car and open the door, they can then use the gizmo to bypass the ignition and drive the car away. The other thing they do is to carry another excellent invention, a wonderful invention for builders and tradies of all sorts. And that, of course, is the highly efficient and powerful battery-charged side grinder. Now, this is a great thing. If you're used to using the big old heavy side grinders that were plugged into the mains, you know how powerful they are, but how clumsy and heavy they are. But these ones, the modern tradie always has the Milwaukee or the DeWalt or the Ryobi. They've got this good gear with the quite light batteries, really powerful, strong, light, portable, and they jump in the car after breaking a quarter window or whatever they want to do, and they hit whatever's holding it, such as the steering lock, with their angle grinder. And I have to tell you that I've seen some tests done lately by a guy who produces an excellent thing called a brake lock, and he has done some tests with steering locks, and some of them can be cut off in 15 seconds, some in 26 seconds, some in 50 seconds. But, even the really good Toyota steering lock, which Toyota sell for $200, pretty serious bit of gear, can be cut in less than a minute. So the net result is gone in less than 60 seconds. The point we're driving at is that car theft is not only always with us, it is back in fashion with a vengeance. And worse, if you live in Melbourne, Victoria, our town, our state, is now the Australian capital of car theft. We should have number plates in this state. Not things like Victoria, the garden state, or Victoria, the education state. We should have number plates, if we were absolutely honest, that say Victoria, the car theft capital, because that's what we have become. 10 years ago, just 10 years ago, half the cars stolen in Australia each year were in New South Wales. Now, that makes sense because it is the most populous state. Guess what? Victoria has absolutely flogged New South Wales in the car theft stakes. In the last 10 years, we have overtaken. Our car thieves down here in Melbourne have overtaken the New South Wales car thieves at a absolutely frightening pace. Now, more than 30,000 cars a year are stolen in Victoria. More than 30,000. It's a big number and it's rising. Even more scary in some respects is the fact that 20% of those cars, we're looking at 6,000 plus, 6,000 to 7,000 on current figures, maybe more, are vanishing off the face of the earth. They vanish. They disappear. It's as if they never existed, often. Sometimes we find the smoking ruins of the shell of the car, but often they just vanish. And that is a sign of two things. And one is that they've been absolutely cannibalised and pulled apart for every movable part. And whatever's left just gets junked and ends up in recycling or something like that. But the others, and we're talking thousands of cars here a year, from Victoria alone, let alone across Australia. So we're talking, several thousand cars a year from Victoria, maybe 10,000 cars a year from Australia, are being loaded in containers, either totally wholly as a car or in parts, to go to offshore places, to interesting foreign countries where VIN numbers and identification numbers don't seem to matter. They're very happy to buy them. Now, the rise of the global car, the rise of global brands has promoted this a lot. The fact that the Toyota, the Japanese-made Toyota, is now driven in probably most countries in the world and much loved and admired across the world as reliable and so forth. That has meant that there is an inexhaustible demand for Toyota cars and Toyota car parts. And so Australians who have got the habit of buying Toyotas for very good reason, because they are good value, they are finding that they are being stolen at an unprecedented rate because the thieves know they can sell them in the Middle East and quite possibly in the Eastern Bloc in Europe, depending, where they go and how they get there. They're very, very saleable. Of course, they're still stealing Audis and Mercedes and Porsches and all that stuff too. But the most stolen cars in Australia tend to be Toyotas. A close second, if it is second, is the Holden Commodore. Now, we no longer make Holden Commodores in this country because we don't make any cars in this country. In fact, I'm not sure what we do make in this country, possibly steering locks. But the Holden Commodore has been so enduringly popular, and there's so many of them, that there is a very big market for spare parts. People want them because they want to fix up the ones they've got. And the fact that they're now getting more scarce means they are worth more as parts. It's the basic law of supply and demand. So when there are a lot of Holden Commodores particularly out there, but a shrinking number of them, it means that those people who have still got the ones that are still going are very keen to get parts for their car, and there is a ready market for car parts, which means thieves can grab them, take them to a chop shop, as they call them, possibly a backyard panel beater or whatever it might be, a nondescript rented factory in a factory block, from anywhere from Corio to Dandenong, you name it, they're there. And they're pinching cars, they're pulling them apart and they're selling the parts, or they are crating them up and selling them offshore. Variations on this story are not new. Regular listeners to this podcast will recall the stories of a very big scoundrel called Rick Renzella. I called him Tricky Ricky because Tricky Ricky became notorious back in the 70s and 80s for ringing in racehorses. He was the man behind one of the great racing scams of racing history, and that was the ring-in scandal of the early 70s, I think 71, down at Casterton in the Western District, where he entered a very slow and ordinary animal, a provincial racehorse from New South Wales that was just about buggered, called Royal School. He entered that horse, Royal School, in a particular race against the crack sprinter of the Western District, I have to say. So this Royal School should never have been able to beat the local champion sprinter. But what Tricky Ricky did was produce a horse under the other horse's name. And this horse was, in fact, Regal Vista, one of the best sprinters of his generation. Now, he wasn't quite a champion, but he was pretty good. He was a pretty good horse, and Rick Renzella had paid pretty good money for him. The horse had a little bit of age on him and a few scars, including a big scar on his rump. He had a great big V-marked scar on his rump where I think he'd cut himself as a young horse on a fence or a float or something. And it was a very distinctive scar. And those people that knew their racehorses intimately, as many trainers and jockeys and strappers do, they knew that the horse with the scar on his rump was really Regal Vista. And we've told this story before in this podcast. Regal Vista won the race when Royal School never could have, and he won it under the name Royal School, of course. And the balloon went up because even though Rick Renzella had got away with several ring-ins before this date, this time a canny old trainer recognised the ring-in horse mentioned it to another trainer, and they mentioned it to the stewards, and then the police got involved. And Tricky Ricky Renzella ended up going to court, and he ended up doing time for being a very dishonest fellow. Now, Tricky Ricky loved racehorses, and he was very fond of horses, and he probably treated horses better than he treated people, to be honest. But his real trade was to be a crooked car dealer. That's what he was very good at, and that's how he started out, and that's what he went back to when he got out of jail. And he had a car yard down on the Bayside. I think I'm going to say Mordialloc, Mentone. And I went there in 1984 because I wanted to trade in my very sick, sorry and sad Triumph Dolomite, which was a nice little English car that had seen better days. And it didn't actually have a working clutch when I drove it about 100 kilometres to get to Renzella's car yard. But I knew when I got there I'd be able to swap it over for an old Valiant Ute that he had. So when we get there, I bunny hop this car into his yard and I park it next to a fence so that it's hard to open the door and all this sort of stuff. And so nobody could see the ding in the door. A bus had hit the side of my car. And I went over and said, Rick, I just drove that down from Kilmore and I want to swap it for that old white Ute you've got advertised. He said, oh yeah, no worries. I said, but one thing I'll need I hopped in the Valiant and checked it. I said, I think the clutch in your Valiant might be a bit short. He said, I'll give you a clutch plate. All right, so he gets a brand new clutch plate out of the back shed and gives it to me. I said, I'll need a roadworthy certificate, which was problematic because it was definitely not roadworthy. And he said, hang on. And he rings up the local garage, which is just around the corner, and a bloke delivers the roadworthy certificate, just all written out and signed. And he said, there'll be another $30. And no inspection. And I just took it, hopped in my new old white Valiant Rocket, and I drove it up the road to Kilmore on its bald tyres. And it lived, not happily ever after, but it lived for a while. And I'm not sure who got the worst of the deal, but it's a line ball. Just goes to show that even honest people like me will try to take down a car dealer just because you can. But Tricky Ricky had a few tricks up his sleeve. Selling dodgy cars with dodgy roadworthies was just light entertainment. What he actually did was he rebirthed stolen cars. I'm telling this story to show that this is something that's always been with us, but we haven't got rid of it. It's got worse. So Tricky Ricky, who got into all that trouble with the racehorses in the 1970s, in 1992, this is a few years after I've traded in the old Triumph on the old Valiant. In 1992, the owner of a stolen Toyota Land Cruiser noticed an ad for a car very like his missing one. He went to a Mordialloc car yard, guess whose, and he saw the car for sale without its number plates. And he thought, that's a cunning disguise, but I recognise it, it's mine. And he hollered for the coppers, and the coppers arrived. When they had a good look around Ricky's Mordialloc car yard, they found 11 Land Cruisers in various stages of disassembly. The engine and chassis numbers had been changed. They'd sort of grind them off and then stamp them with new numbers and all sorts of stuff. And new wheels fitted, and they'd been re-registered. They're tricky stuff. Probably bribing someone somewhere to turn a blind eye, but who'd know? It turned out that Renzella's crew of thieves, he was sort of like Fagin with his, thieves. He had all these blokes working for him. They'd stolen 57 Land Cruisers and had sold 7 for a start to Nauru, which is interesting, which is not far away. They like a good Land Cruiser in Nauru, as they do everywhere, really. They love them in Darwin, they love them in New Guinea, they love them in the Middle East, they love them. And Ricky got into a bit of hot water, but he was eventually freed by the Supreme Court, which was a mistake by the Supreme Court because Ricky went straight back into business. He just knew no other way than to be a crook. And in late 1993, you'll notice it's not a long time later. It's only the following year. Tricky Ricky drove his Mercedes into Southland Shopping Centre car park, and he dropped off what police call an associate. That would be a tea leaf, a car thief. And the associate impressed watching police. The police were watching by stealing a Land Cruiser in 90 seconds flat. Back at a factory in Hyatt, he'd moved. He'd said, I can't be stripping these things down at Mordialloc anymore because they're onto that. He had a rented factory in Hyatt. Back at Hyatt were another 25 Land Cruisers being dismantled for parts. And meanwhile, Rick was pinched also for growing $1 million worth of hydroponic marijuana. Needless to say, he went back to the slammer. Now, none of that would have surprised his distinguished former defence counsel in the ring-in case, a bloke called Phil Opus, who's no longer with us, but Phil Opus QC was a very astute defence counsel. And in his book that he wrote about the ring-in case, he said, Renzella could be described as cunning but not clever. Judge Rapke went into a bit more detail. He said, when he sentenced Renzella, he said, the fraud was born in a mind that was primed by greed and nurtured in cunning and then executed with boldness. And I think that sort of sums up Rick Renzella. But he's no longer with us. Rick died, as I think we've mentioned before. Rick died not many years ago. And I did advocate that somebody look in the coffin to make sure he was actually in it. But that's a story for another day. Rick Renzella is no longer with us, but people like him very much are. And they are doing what he did, but on a bigger scale, in what I would suggest is probably amongst the most organised crime in this country. We've got, let's look at organised crime. We've got people bringing in literally tons of illegal drugs. That's big organised crime. We've got people bringing in illegal armaments, I would suggest. Not as big as the drugs, but organised. And we've got people ripping off the taxpayer on the big build in Victoria. That's highly organised crime in its way. And of course it's linked with the drug rackets and all that. They're all sort of holding hands, all these guys. And we've also got organised car theft. Now, 33,000 plus cars stolen every year in Victoria. Half of Australia's national car theft numbers for a year. At least 20% of them are vanishing entirely. We mentioned that earlier. That is many thousands of cars. And most of them are going offshore. This is highly organised crime. If you said to the average accountant and, airliner pilot, intelligent people who know their way around, could you organise to export thousands of cars a year to be sold on the black market in the Middle East or elsewhere? I think they would find that pretty challenging. It would be pretty hard to do. It is highly organised crime and it must have its tentacles in various branches of officialdom. They must have certain people on side. They must be getting tipped off about certain things to be able to get away with it. And I find it hard to believe that law enforcement in Australia, the various state forces and the Commonwealth Police and whatever, do not have some pretty good idea who is mixed up in this trade, because it will go hand in glove to some extent with importing drugs and other contraband. Send cars out, bring stuff in. Crooks love that. They love that synergy. It used to be send out wildlife, birds and stuff, and bring in drugs. Well, this puts that in the shade. How does that affect all of us? Well, it affects us because if you drive a certain sorts of car, all cars are subject to theft in a way, but some are very sought after. If you drive Toyota Land Cruisers or any version of a Toyota four-wheel drive, Hilux, Prado, etc., you drive Holden Commodores, particularly the good ones, the high-end Holden Commodores, the later models, the ones that are really straight, the ones with the good V8 motors, etc., the sought-after models. They're relatively expensive when they were bought. Some of them are worth 50% or more than when they were bought new, because if they've been kept with low mileage and looked after and garaged and all that sort of stuff, they are actually accruing value year on year because they are going to get rarer, and Australians essentially love them. These are the cars that remind people of when Brock was king of the mountain, and they have a reputation and an image that is very potent in this country, and therefore they are very saleable, and the parts are very saleable. And also, because they are a part of the big family of General Motors cars, their most excellent V8 motors and transmissions are very saleable because they fit straight into other General Motors products overseas. They're the same motors. They're the good American V8, the good American gearbox, and it slots straight into Camaros or whatever it might be. And that is why, listeners, you have situations such as this. In July 2024, now this is about the beginning of the time when Victoria started to become the car theft capital of Australia, mid-2024. That really took off. In that time, during that month of July, a karate instructor called Mark Curtis is visiting his extremely ill brother in Mulgrave Hospital. Now, his brother they feared that he was dying, and in fact, many months later, he did die. It's a tragic footnote to this story. Mark Curtis was taking his mother, who was obviously distraught and upset, to see his brother. And his brother had a rented house or shared a house in Wheelers Hill, which is pretty close to Mulgrave. And the mother said, we will stay at the brother's house because it's close to the hospital. And they went in and spent 11 or 12 hours with the very ill man. And then they went back to the house at Wheelers Hill to stay the night before resuming their bedside vigil next day. Mark Curtis owned a crackerjack HSV Holden Commodore Club Sport. He paid big money for it, and he'd looked after it perfectly. At the time we're talking about, this car was 8 years old, but it looked brand new. He'd bought it in 2016. It was one of a short run of only 300 of this particular configuration that was produced. Greatly coveted by collectors and petrol heads. He'd clocked up only 60-odd thousand kilometres in it in the 8 years, which is not a lot, and it was impeccable and flawless. Normally he would always want to take it home to his house in Canterbury and lock it up in a garage out of the public gaze. But because of the situation with his brother in hospital and his mother not wanting him to leave, she wanted him to stay in this house. At Wheelers Hill, he said, no worries. So he parks it out in the driveway and they go to bed and they jump up early next day to go back to hospital and the car's gone. He goes outside, not there. He looks on the lawn. On the lawn he sees something. He sees the tracking device. He had a little tracking device in it, the one that people use in suitcases. And he had it sitting in a sunglasses case under the seat of the car. Good idea. But professional thieves, they know this stuff. They'd found that tracking device and they'd thrown it out on the lawn. And that's what he found. So he had no way of knowing where it had gone. All he knew is that it had gone. He rings the police. They said, mate, check on your e-tag if it's gone through the toll roads. And indeed, it had. It had gone on the Eastlink tunnel at 3:15 in the morning. That's when it had been stolen. And that would suggest that it was heading probably southwards, ultimately. It depends where you want to go, but it could have gone to the east or the north or down to the south. And indeed, as it turns out, it was heading south. And some days later, he gets a call from a group calling themselves Stolen Cars of Melbourne. There's this sort of self-help group of people that see cars burnt out by the side of the road and they take photographs and they check the if there's any identification left, like VIN numbers or whatever the numbers are. And they got onto him and said, oh, yeah, this is your car. It's down on a back dirt road out the back of Cranbourne. And he said, oh, well, is it really? Is it really mine? And they sent him the VIN number, and it was. He looked up his rego, and it was. And he says it broke his heart. He drove down to Cranbourne, to this dirt road, and he goes there. And his absolutely perfect car has been reduced. And he sent us photographs of this. It's striking. No wonder he said he almost cried. It's just the shell of a car. There's just a bit of the body. The bonnet, the doors are all gone. The sunroof's been ripped out. The boot's gone. The motor's gone. The transmission's gone. The wheels are gone. It's only the shell of the car that's left. Enough that probably two guys could just pick it up and put it on the back of a ute or on a trailer. And indeed, they've dropped it off out on this dirt road. And I think they've torched it, but just to kill fingerprints and DNA or whatever. But there was really nothing there to burn. You know, there wasn't much left in it. The seats were gone, and all that stuff that burned so readily wasn't in it anymore. It was vanished. And he thought, well, that's that. And 10 hours later, the police got onto him to say they'd found the car. Well, he said, I've already found it, thank you. And he got his insurance. He got $64,000 back. He said that was fine. The insurers treated him fairly. But the reality was the car was by this stage worth about $94,000, not 64. And so he'd actually lost 30 grand on his investment, which was sad. That would appear to be the end of the story, but it isn't. Some weeks later, he gets another call from Knox Police. And they said, we've just knocked over a warehouse or factory or something. And guess what we found set up on a pallet, shrink wrapped, all set to go in a container to go on a ship to be shipped offshore. The motor and transmission from your car. They were able to identify it. And he went there and indeed there it was. All shrink wrapped, perfectly clean, steam cleaned, absolutely schmick and beautiful. All wrapped up in that plastic stuff on a pallet ready to move offshore. This is how organised these people are. And not just it. There's a lot of other gear that was all going offshore. These people are so organised. They've got factories. They've got really expert car strippers with the best pneumatic tools that money can buy, stripping cars as if they're working at the pit stop in the Formula One races. That is when our mate Mark Curtis realised just how pervasive and how huge the car theft racket is. Now, I'll bookend that story. In this last 18 months, where car theft has gone mad in Victoria, we're absolutely outstripping everybody. An old friend of mine, a guy who lives at Omeo, I went to school with this guy. His name is Rod. Rod was a very fast runner at school, pretty fair footballer and good bloke, and always a bit mechanical. I remember he was always keen on cars when he was at school. And a few years ago, I think he had a school bus line business and he sold it. And he'd always liked cars and he needed to drive his wife, who was very ill. He needed to drive her from Omeo to Melbourne for treatment regularly, I think every week or something. And it was either a matter of buying something to live in Melbourne or to drive down. So he said, I'll buy a good car and we'll do the drive. So he bought a crackerjack SSV Holden V8, 6-litre V8, red in colour, manual. He said, best car he's ever owned, beautiful car. And he said, I've got to drive my wife to the doctors and we might as well do it in comfort and safety, which is fair enough. It was a sad ending to that story, but this is what he did. And he used to drive it to Melbourne, drive it home, and his wife eventually passed away. So there's a bit of tragedy in this story as well. And he then thought, well, that car, I'll keep it because it's got sentimental value. But he kept it sort of under lock and key, more or less. He looked after it. And he mostly drove his Toyota Land Cruiser because he lives up in the mountains and people up there tend to drive Land Cruisers or that sort of stuff. And he had a good Land Cruiser, so he mostly drove that. But Last November, so this is November 2025, and that is almost 18 months after the previous story we told about Mark Curtis. Our friend Rod O'Connell has to come to Melbourne to fly to Adelaide to a friend's birthday or whatever, something. He thinks, I'll drive the Commodore because it's a manual, and they say that manuals don't get stolen as much because the young guys don't like driving them or can't drive them. So he goes to the long-term car park at Tullamarine and he parks his really good red Holden SSV and he hops on the plane to Adelaide. Well, he reckons by the time he gets to Adelaide, it's already gone. He gets a phone call from somewhere to say, yeah, car's turned up, it's going through red lights and it's doing this and doing that. And it's been pinched from the car park. He comes back and it's not around. And 5 days later it turns up, back in the car park. Would you believe it? And he said, big problem. He said the guy's been driving it all around Melbourne at speed, crashing red lights, doing illegal things, doing much badness. In fact, our friend Rod, who's telling the story, got 4 summonses later for traffic infringements. And he said when this bloke had driven it back to the car park because he wanted to steal another car, and they actually caught him. The federal police caught this bloke dumping the half-stripped Commodore. They'd pinched everything they could out of it, all the flash wheels and tyres, bits and pieces they'd pinched out of it, about 30 grand's worth. And they just put some old dodgy wheels and ball tyres on it, just so it was just drivable. And he'd driven it back into the car park to pick up a nice new Toyota Land Cruiser, probably to sell offshore. And he was sprung. They caught him. And Rod is pleased they caught him, but he was very disappointed in the condition of his car, which had to be written off. The insurer said if you want it, you'll have to go to the auctions and buy it at the auctions, but it's a $30,000 repair. And in the end, he let it go. And the police were pretty good to him, and they said, look, it's just a big car thief supermarket, the long-term car park. And they're talking, mano a mano. They're talking frankly. They're saying it's not a good place to leave a Toyota Land Cruiser or a Commodore or anything that the thieves really want, because they just wander around looking for them. And they get into them very easily because they've got the gear, and they can start them fairly easily because they've got the gear. And then Rod, who's, a smart guy, but he's from a pretty honest place, he said, but how do they get out of the place with the boom gates? They said, oh, no worries, they just tailgate other customers. When Fred Nurk drives out, they just tailgate Fred Nurk out and go past him. And Rod O'Connell formed the view that the airport authorities don't really try terribly hard to promote security in the car parks. He thinks that they just go through the motions and that it is far too easy for thieves to get in and out of the car parks, pinching whatever they fancy. And he learnt his lesson the hard way, and he said, well, from now on, if I want to fly somewhere, I'm going to take a taxi or a bus to the airport and not leave a car there in the long-term car park. Well, that story demonstrates the effect on the ordinary Victorian citizen of organised car theft, or even disorganised car theft. The fact that it is so easy to get away with, it's so prevalent. The police are run off their feet. They can't catch all the car thieves because there's too many of them. There are so many stolen cars at any one moment. I think they're stealing one every half hour or something. They're all over the place. And the result is that ordinary people, like all honest citizens, all honest motorists, are paying far more for insurance than they otherwise would. We all run the risk of being, run down by lunatics escaping in stolen cars, running through red lights and doing all the crazy stuff they do in stolen cars. And of course, car thieves supply getaway cars for extremely bad people who do extremely bad crimes. So every time we see another gangland shooting, another arson of a tobacco shop or whatever it might be, often murders, We always hear police later discovered a burnt-out Audi or whatever it might be, a getaway car, that has been torched well away, usually from the scene. And, of course, they've been picked up, usually, I think, in another stolen car and taken to yet a third place where they revert to their own cars or whatever they do. All these things, massively high insurance rates, that hurts everybody. The sheer danger of lunatics driving around in stolen cars at speed, on drugs and at speed, is totally dangerous. A woman with twin boys, 4-year-old boys, went inside to get her 7-year-old daughter to go to kindergarten or something in the northern suburb of Doreen. This is just a few months ago. And this young mother, she's got twin boys, 4 years old. She straps them into their car. She whips inside to get her daughter, which you can understand is 3 kids, to bring her out to strap her in. And while she's in getting her daughter, for 30 seconds, two young, a 19-year-old and a 24-year-old, run up, steal the car and drive off. And she's lost her twins. She was terrified. She thought her kids could be killed or anything. She did not know. For 45 minutes, her kids were gone. You know what those thieves did? They dropped each of those little 4-year-old boys, not together even. They dropped one at one street somewhere by the side of the road and at 4 years old, and another one at another street beside the road. Those kids could have been run over. Anything could have happened to them. This is the sort of stuff that car thieves are doing to ordinary people. And, you know, we can crack jokes about Rick Rensella and all the rest of it, but none of it's funny, and all of it hurts all of us. Higher insurance, the risk of injury or death, and also the promulgation of violent crime. Car thieves enable violent criminals to do violent things, to do robberies, arsons and murder, all of these antisocial acts that affect all of us, every Australian, but especially every Victorian, because Victoria, on the evidence, is Australia's organised crime capital. Good luck. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcastssold@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcastssold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.